blood on Italian marble tells a very specific story. It screams of secrets kept behind towering iron gates and wealth used as a weapon. Richard Sterling believed his Connecticut mansion was a fortress where his rules were the only laws. He thought striking his pregnant wife was a private matter, a brutal correction she would quietly endure like always. He was wrong, because while Richard was busy playing a god inside his gilded cage, he forgot one crucial detail about the woman bleeding on his floor. Monsters are rarely born from nothing, and her family was finally coming home. The rain began to fall over Greenwich, Connecticut, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, fractured shadows across the sprawling, manicured lawns of the Sterling estate. To the outside world, the 40-acre property at the end of a private, tree-lined cul-de-sac was a monument to the American dream. It boasted a 12-bedroom Tudor-style mansion, an indoor infinity pool, and a climate-controlled garage housing a collection of vintage European sports cars. It was the home of Richard Sterling, the 42-year-old titan of commercial real estate who had built an empire by swallowing smaller development firms across the eastern seaboard. Richard was handsome in a sharp, predatory way. His tailored Brioni suits and practiced, easy smile graced the covers of local business journals, painting the picture of a ruthless but respectable capitalist. He was a man who attended charity galas, wrote massive checks to local politicians, and shook hands with a firm, dominant grip. But inside the mansion, behind the heavy mahogany doors and the million-dollar state-of-the-art security system, the American dream was a suffocating nightmare. Kate Sterling stood in the center of what was soon to be the nursery, her hand resting gently on her swollen abdomen. She was 7 months pregnant. At 29, Kate possessed a quiet, understated beauty that had captivated Richard the moment he saw her 3 years ago in a quiet coffee shop in Boston. Back then she was just Kate, a woman with a mysterious lack of family history, a small savings account, and a desperate desire for a quiet, unremarkable life. Richard had swept in like a hurricane, offering stability, luxury, and a fierce, almost suffocating love. It hadn't taken long for the ferocity of that love to reveal its true nature, control. The first time he hit her, it was a year into their marriage. He had claimed the pressure of a multi-million-dollar acquisition had simply overwhelmed him. He had wept, bought her a diamond tennis bracelet, and sworn on his life it would never happen again. Kate had wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him, because running away was not a simple option for her. Running meant going back to a life she had barely escaped with her soul intact. But the apologies grew shorter, and the violence grew more frequent. Richard's paranoia festered in the shadows of his success. He dictated who she spoke to, what she wore, and how she spent her days. When she became pregnant, Kate thought things might change. She hoped the baby would soften the jagged edges of his temper. Instead, the pregnancy only intensified his possessiveness. She was no longer just his wife. She was the vessel carrying his air. Tonight, the air in the house was thick with an impending storm, both outside and in. Kate could feel the barometric drop in her bones. Richard was due home from Manhattan at any moment, and the news out of the city was not good. A massive zoning permit for his flagship project in Hudson Yards had been denied by the city council. She had seen the alert flash on her restricted tablet. Millions of dollars were tied up, investors would be furious, and Richard would need an outlet for his rage. Kate moved methodically through the nursery, her heart hammering a steady, anxious rhythm against her ribs. She smoothed the pristine white linen of the crib, adjusting a stuffed bear by a fraction of an inch. Everything had to be perfect. The house had to be silent. Dinner had to be flawless, and she had to be entirely agreeable. The heavy thud of the front door echoing up the grand staircase made her freeze. Kate!" His voice didn't carry a greeting. It carried a demand. It echoed off the vaulted ceilings of the foyer, sharp and laced with an exhaustion that terrified her. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, and walked out of the nursery. She descended the curving staircase, her hand clutching the banister for support. The sheer weight of the child in her belly made her center of gravity feel off, but she forced her posture to remain upright. Richard was standing by the entryway console, aggressively shrugging off his wet trench coat. He didn't bother hanging it up, letting it drop to the imported Persian rug. His tie was already loosened, his jaw clenched so tightly she could see the muscle ticking beneath his skin. "How was the drive, Richard?" Kate asked softly, keeping her distance. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot and cold. "The drive was a miserable crawl through a monsoon. The city is full of incompetent fools, and my lawyers are useless." He kicked off his dress shoes. "Is dinner ready? Tell me Maria didn't burn the roast again." "Maria left at 5, just like you asked," Kate replied evenly, moving toward the kitchen. "I made dinner. It's keeping warm in the oven." Richard followed her, his heavy footsteps thudding against the hardwood floor. "You made it? I thought I told you to stay off your feet. You're supposed to be resting. Do you want to cause a complication? Because that's exactly how you cause a complication." "I feel fine, Richard. The doctor said light activity is good for me," she murmured, pulling an oven mitt onto her hand. "I don't care what the doctor said," Richard snapped, closing the distance between them. He grabbed her wrist, not hard enough to bruise yet, but tight enough to send a warning jolt up her arm. "I care about what I said. You carry my child. You do as I instruct." Kate swallowed hard, forcing herself to look down. "I'm sorry. I just wanted to make sure you had a good meal after a hard day." He released her wrist with a huff of derision. "Plate it. Bring it to the dining room. And pour me a scotch. A double." The dining room was a cavernous space, dominated by a long, polished oak table that could seat 20. Tonight, they sat at opposite ends, separated by an expanse of gleaming wood and dead silence. Outside, the storm had intensified. Thunder rattled the antique window panes, and lightning cast brief, harsh illuminations across Richard's face as he chewed his steak. Kate picked at her food, the nausea of anxiety churning in her stomach. She watched him covertly. He was drinking the scotch too fast. It was his 3rd glass since walking through the door. "The meat is dry," Richard stated flatly, dropping his fork onto the porcelain plate with a loud clatter. Kate flinched. I can make something else. There's some pasta." "I don't want pasta, Kate," he interrupted, his voice dropping an octave. This was the dangerous tone, the quiet before the eruption. "I want a wife who can follow simple instructions. I want a peaceful home." "Is that too much to ask? I bust my arse in the city. I deal with blood-sucking politicians trying to ruin my legacy, and I come home to dry meat and a wife who thinks she knows better than me." "Richard, please. You're stressed. Let's just go upstairs and—" "Don't tell me what I am!" he roared, slamming both hands down on the table. The crystal wine glasses shuddered. Kate immediately pushed her chair back, instinctively crossing her arms over her swollen belly. Okay, Richard. I'm sorry." He stood up, his chair scraping violently against the floor. "You're always sorry, Kate. Always so incredibly sorry. But you never learn, do you?" He began to walk down the length of the table toward her. Kate stood up, her breath hitching. She backed away toward the arched doorway leading to the living room. "Richard, stop." "The baby," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "This has nothing to do with the baby," he shouted, closing the gap. "This has to do with respect." He lunged forward. Kate tried to turn and run, but she was heavy and slow. Richard's hand caught the back of her hair, yanking her backward. She screamed as the force threw her off balance. Before she could catch herself, his open palm struck the side of her face with a sickening crack. The force of the blow sent a burst of white light exploding behind Kate's eyes. She spun, her legs giving out, and she crashed hard onto the hardwood floor. Pain, sharp and immediate, radiated through her jaw and shoulder, but her only thought was her stomach. She curled into a tight ball on the floor, wrapping her arms protectively around her unborn child, gasping for air as the wind was knocked out of her. Blood immediately began to pool in her mouth, metallic and warm. She had bitten her tongue and the inside of her cheek. Richard stood over her, his chest heaving, his fists clenched at his sides. He looked down at her with a mixture of disgust and dark satisfaction. "Look what you made me do," he hissed. "You push and you push. This is your fault." Kate squeezed her eyes shut, a sob tearing from her throat. "Please," she whimpered. "My baby. Please." "My baby," Richard corrected her coldly. "And don't worry. The child is protected in there. You're the one who needs to learn a lesson." He kicked the side of her thigh, hard enough to leave a deep bruise, but avoiding her stomach. "Get up. Clean up the mess in the kitchen and go to bed. I can't even look at you right now." He turned on his heel and walked toward his study, slamming the heavy oak door behind him. Kate lay on the floor for what felt like an eternity. The right side of her face was throbbing violently, and her vision was blurred with tears. She focused entirely on the movement inside her belly. A minute passed. Then 2. Finally, a small, reassuring kick pushed against her palm. A ragged sigh of relief escaped her lips. The baby was alive, but a chilling realization settled over her like a heavy shroud. Richard had crossed a new line. He hadn't cared about the risk to the child. The violence was escalating faster than she had anticipated. If she stayed, he was going to kill her. And he would take the baby. Slowly, agonizingly, Kate pushed herself up off the floor. Her body ached, and a thin trail of blood dripped from her lip onto the pristine white collar of her maternity blouse. She staggered toward the downstairs powder room, locking the door behind her with a trembling hand. She leaned against the marble sink, staring at her reflection in the gilded mirror. The skin around her eye was already swelling, a vicious purple bruise blooming across her cheekbone. She looked like a ghost. With shaky hands, Kate reached beneath the bathroom vanity. She felt along the back of the heavy wooden cabinet, her fingers brushing against a false panel she had installed 3 months ago when Richard was away on a business trip. She pressed a small latch, and the panel popped loose. Inside was a small, black, waterproof lockbox. Kate pulled it out and opened it. Resting inside was a thick stack of cash, a fake passport, and a cheap, prepaid burner phone. She had promised herself she would never use the phone. Using the phone meant invoking a ghost from a past she had spent 10 years trying to outrun. Before she was Kate Sterling, before she was even Kate Montgomery, her name had been Kate Volkoff. Her father, Alexander Volkoff, was a man whose name was whispered in the darkest corridors of power across Europe and the eastern seaboard. He wasn't just a businessman. He was the head of a sprawling, deeply entrenched syndicate that controlled shipping ports, politicians, and massive swaths of illicit trade. Growing up, Kate had been a princess in a fortress of blood money. When she was 19, she had witnessed her father casually order the execution of a rival associate in their own living room. That night, she vanished. She changed her name, buried her past, and traded the terrifying world of organized crime for what she thought was normal life. She had sworn to never return to the Volkoff family. Her father's love was just as controlling, just as possessive as Richard's. but backed by armies of men with silenced weapons. Kate stared at the burner phone. Her thumb hovered over the power button. If she made this call, she would be trading a domestic tyrant for an international monster. Her life of hiding would be over. She would be swept back into her father's brutal empire, a pawn to be protected. Yes, but a prisoner nonetheless. Another sharp pain shot through her bruised thigh, and she looked down at her swollen stomach. "It's not about you anymore," she told herself. "It's about the baby." Richard could easily buy the local police. He had the judges in his pocket. If she ran normally, he would hunt her down, legally destroy her, and take full custody of the child. She needed an entity stronger than the law. She needed a force that Richard's money couldn't buy and his arrogance couldn't comprehend. Kate powered on the phone. It took 30 seconds to find a signal. She dialed a number she had committed to memory a decade ago, a number that connected directly to the central clearinghouse of her father's head of security, a man named Victor. The line rang once, twice. "Speak," a deep, gravelly voice answered in Russian. Kate closed her eyes, a single tear cutting a track through the blood on her face. She spoke in her native tongue, a language she hadn't used in 10 years. "Victor, it's Kate." The silence on the other end of the line was absolute, dense with sudden shock. "Lyubimaya," Victor finally whispered. "Beloved." "Where are you?" "Greenwich, Connecticut," Kate said, her voice shaking but resolute. She rattled off the address of the mansion. "I am pregnant. The man I am with. He has hurt me. He will kill me and take the child." The pause that followed was brief, but it carried the weight of a death sentence. "Is the man in the house?" Victor asked, his voice entirely devoid of emotion now. It was the voice of a man making a tactical assessment. "Yes." "Do not move. Do not let him see the phone. Alexander is in New York. We will be there in 30 minutes. May God have mercy on whoever this man is, Kate, because your father will not." The line went dead. Kate disassembled the burner phone, flushed the SIM card down the toilet, and hid the battery and casing back in the wall panel. She washed the blood from her face with cold water, wincing as she patted her bruised cheek dry. She unlocked the bathroom door and stepped back out into the silent, dim hallway. From the study, she could hear the faint sound of classical music. Vivaldi's Winter. It was Richard's favorite piece to listen to when he was trying to center his intellect. He was pouring himself another expensive drink, entirely oblivious to the monumental gears that had just begun to turn in the darkness outside his property. Kate walked slowly toward the living room, sitting heavily on a plush velvet sofa. She wrapped a knitted throw blanket around her shivering shoulders and waited. The storm outside raged on, lightning tearing jagged gashes across the night sky, illuminating the manicured front lawn in flashing, strobing bursts. Inside his mahogany-paneled study, Richard Sterling felt the familiar rush of adrenaline and justification settling into his system. He took a slow sip of a $50-a-glass scotch, savoring the burn. He didn't feel guilt. He felt vindicated. Kate had been pushing his boundaries, questioning his authority in his own home. He had merely provided a necessary correction. That was how the world worked. The strong dictated the terms to the weak. It was how he ran his company, and it was how he ran his marriage. He walked over to the massive, floor-to-ceiling window behind his desk, looking out into the torrential rain. His property was impenetrable. The 10-foot wrought-iron gates at the end of the driveway were reinforced steel, monitored by thermal cameras and a private security firm stationed just 2 miles away. He paid a premium to ensure nothing touched his world without his permission. He glanced at the antique grandfather clock in the corner. 9:45 p.m. He would let Kate stew in her fear for another hour. Then he would go upstairs, offer a calculated apology, and she would forgive him. She always did. Where else would she go? She was a nobody from nowhere. She belonged to him. Suddenly, the music on his high-end audio system crackled with a burst of static, then cut out entirely. Richard frowned, tapping the glass of his scotch. "Damn Wi-Fi," he muttered, turning to check the router on his desk. But as he turned, the primary lights in the study flickered and died. A second later, the backup generator kicked in, bathing the room in the dimmer yellow light of the emergency circuits. Richard's annoyance flared into mild concern. The power grid in Greenwich rarely went down, even in a storm. He picked up his cell phone to call the security firm. No signal. "What the hell?" he grumbled. He walked over to the landline on his desk. He picked up the receiver. Dead air. No dial tone. A cold prickle of unease finally touched the back of Richard's neck. He walked back to the window, peering out into the darkness. Through the driving rain, he saw something that made his breath catch in his throat. The heavy, 10-foot iron security gates at the end of his quarter-mile driveway were completely open. There had been no alarm, no warning from the gatehouse. And moving slowly, silently, up the long, curving gravel driveway was a procession of vehicles. They weren't police cruisers. They were 4 identical, pitch-black Chevrolet Suburbans. They drove in perfect, tight formation, their headlights off. They navigated the dark, winding driveway, using only the ambient light of the storm, moving with the predatory grace of sharks gliding through deep water. "Hey, security!" Richard yelled into the empty room, rushing to the wall-mounted intercom system. He slammed the button for the front gate. Static. He hit the button for the roving patrol. Nothing. Panic, sharp and unfamiliar, began to claw at his chest. Who were these people? Was it a home invasion? A targeted hit by a rival developer? He ran to his desk drawer, unlocking it frantically. He pulled out a sleek 9mm Glock he kept for emergencies, checking the magazine with trembling hands. He was Richard Sterling. Nobody walked onto his property without an invitation. He sprinted out of the study and into the main hallway. Kate was still sitting on the couch in the living room, staring blankly ahead. "Kate, get upstairs!" Richard barked. "Rack the slide of the pistol. Someone breached the gate. Move!" Kate slowly turned her head to look at him. The bruising on her face was stark under the emergency lights. She didn't look terrified anymore. She looked remarkably, terrifyingly calm. "I'm not going anywhere, Richard," she said softly. "Are you insane? Get upstairs right now, you stupid bitch!" he screamed, his veneer of control completely shattering. Before he could cross the room to grab her, a sound echoed from the front of the house that froze the blood in his veins. It wasn't a knock. It was the mechanical, heavy thud of a breaching charge being clamped onto his reinforced front door. Boom! The explosion was deafening. The heavy, custom-made oak double doors were violently blown off their hinges, sending a shower of splintered wood and twisted metal flying across the marble foyer. The concussive wave knocked Richard backward, sending his pistol clattering across the floor out of his reach. The storm howled through the gaping entrance, bringing the rain and wind into the pristine house. Through the smoke and the driving rain, shadows moved. 6 men poured into the foyer in absolute silence. They were dressed in tactical black, their faces obscured by balaclavas, holding compact, suppressed assault rifles leveled directly at Richard. They didn't shout commands. They didn't identify themselves. They simply moved with lethal, synchronized precision, forming a perimeter around the entryway. Richard scrambled backward on the marble floor, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Who are you? What do you want? I have money. Take whatever you want," he shrieked, his voice cracking in absolute terror. The tactical team parted, stepping aside to create a pathway through the shattered doorway. Out of the darkness of the storm stepped a single figure. He didn't wear tactical gear. He wore a sharply tailored, dark wool overcoat that fell to his knees, perfectly impervious to the raging weather. He was an older man, perhaps in his late 60s, but he carried an aura of absolute, crushing authority. His hair was silver, slicked back, and his eyes, pale, ice blue, and entirely devoid of warmth, locked onto Richard, lying pathetic and trembling on the floor. The man slowly peeled off a pair of black leather gloves, tucking them into his pocket. He ignored Richard completely, his gaze drifting past the cowering real estate mogul, scanning the living room until his eyes fell upon the woman sitting on the couch. When the old man saw the bruised, swollen side of Kate's face, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. A muscle twitched in his jaw, the only sign of the immense, catastrophic violence boiling beneath his calm exterior. "Hello, Dorogaya," Alexander Volkov rumbled, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that commanded the entire space. "My dear." Kate stood up slowly, her hands resting on her pregnant belly. She looked at the terrifying kingpin standing in the ruins of her front door, the father she had spent a decade hiding from. "Hello, Papa," she replied. Richard, still on the floor, whipped his head back and forth between Kate and the man in the overcoat. "Papa!" he choked out, his mind failing to process the impossible reality unfolding before him. "Kate, who are these people?" Alexander Volkov slowly turned his pale blue eyes back down to Richard. He stepped forward, the heel of his Italian leather shoe crunching loudly on the splintered wood of the ruined door. "I am the man," Alexander said, his voice quiet but echoing with lethal promise, "who is going to show you what a real monster looks like." The shattered mahogany of the front door lay scattered across the imported Italian marble, a physical manifestation of Richard Sterling's dismantled reality. The storm outside raged on, whipping wind and rain into the once pristine foyer. But inside, the air was deadly still. The tactical team stood like statues, their suppressed rifles angled toward the floor but ready to snap up in a fraction of a second. Richard scrambled backward until his spine hit the base of the grand curving staircase. His tailored Brioni trousers were soaked from the puddle of rainwater gathering on the floor, and his chest heaved with shallow, panicked breaths. He looked at the silver-haired patriarch standing before him, desperately trying to process the magnitude of his error. "Look, I don't know who you are," Richard stammered, raising his hands in a placating gesture. He tried to summon the commanding tone he used in boardrooms across Manhattan, but it came out as a pathetic squeak. "I'm a very wealthy man. I have connections. I play golf with the district attorney of Fairfield County. If this is about money, name your price. Just tell your men to lower their weapons." Alexander Volkov didn't blink. He slowly unbuttoned his soaked overcoat, revealing an impeccably tailored dark charcoal suit beneath. He took a deliberate step forward, the sound of his leather sole echoing sharply. "Connections," Alexander murmured, rolling the word around in his mouth, as if tasting something foul. His Russian accent was faint, polished away by decades of operating at the highest echelons of global power, but the glacial cadence remained. "You think you have connections, Mr. Sterling. You think because you bully local zoning boards and leverage mezzanine debt on glass towers, you understand power." Alexander knelt slowly, his knees popping slightly in the quiet room. He brought his face level with Richard's. Up close, Alexander's eyes were terrifying, hollow and absolute. The eyes of a man who had ordered the deaths of hundreds without losing a single night of sleep. "My name is Alexander Volkov," he said softly. Richard's breath hitched. Even in the insulated, sanitized world of commercial real estate, rumors bled through from the criminal underworld. The Volkov Syndicate wasn't just a street gang. They were a sovereign entity. They controlled deep-water shipping lines out of Rotterdam, moved billions through shadow banks in Cyprus, and owned politicians from Albany to Moscow. "Volkov," Richard whispered, all the blood draining from his face. He looked wildly at Kate, who remained standing by the living room archway, her face bruised but her posture rigid. "Kate, you're his." "She is my blood," Alexander finished for him, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "She is my only daughter, a daughter who fled my protection to live amongst sheep like you. And you, a pathetic, insecure little boy in a custom suit, thought it was your right to lay your hands on her." "It was an accident," Richard pleaded, tears of pure terror finally spilling over his cheeks. "I was stressed. The Hudson Yards deal fell through." Before Richard could finish his excuse, Alexander's hand shot out with blinding speed. He didn't hit Richard. Instead, he clamped his massive iron-grip fingers around Richard's right wrist, the hand that had struck Kate. Alexander didn't shout. He didn't curse. He simply squeezed, twisting the wrist at an unnatural angle. Richard screamed, a high, reedy sound of pure agony that bounced off the vaulted ceilings. He writhed, trying to pull away, but Alexander's grip was absolute. "Victor," Alexander said calmly, not breaking eye contact with the sobbing billionaire. From the shadows of the doorway, the massive, broad-shouldered man Kate had spoken to on the phone stepped forward. Victor moved with the heavy, unavoidable momentum of a freight train. He didn't carry a rifle. His hands were weapons enough. "Yes, boss," Victor grunted. "Mr. Sterling is very proud of his empire," Alexander noted, finally releasing Richard's wrist and standing up. He casually wiped his hand with a silk pocket square. "He believes his money protects him. Show him the fragility of his world." Victor reached into his tactical vest and produced a sleek, encrypted satellite tablet. He tapped the screen a few times and tossed it onto the marble floor in front of Richard. "Look at the screen, Sobaka," Victor growled. "Dog." Richard, clutching his sprained wrist to his chest, peered down at the glowing screen. It displayed a live feed of his offshore banking portfolios, accounts he had hidden in the Cayman Islands and the British Virgin Islands, untraceable funds he used to dodge the IRS and pay off city officials. As he watched, the balances, totaling nearly $80 million, began to plummet. 80 million, 40 million, 12 million, 0. What are you doing?" Richard gasped, his mind snapping. "That's my life. You can't do that. That's secure." "Nothing is secure from us," Alexander stated, walking over to Kate and gently, reverently touching her uninjured cheek. "My financial architects have been inside your network since Kate called us 30 minutes ago. Your liquid assets have been seized and routed through a dozen shell companies. By morning, your commercial properties will be hit with fabricated, airtight federal liens. Your investors will receive anonymous dossiers detailing your embezzlement and your illegal kickbacks. The SEC will be knocking on your door by noon." Richard curled into a fetal position on the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. The veneer of the alpha male had evaporated, leaving behind a pathetic, hollow shell. "You're ruining me," Richard wept into the cold marble. Alexander turned back, a cold smile finally touching the corners of his mouth. "Ruining you? No. Ruining you would be a mercy. I am erasing you. But first, there is the matter of physical restitution." Alexander nodded once to Victor. Victor stepped forward, his heavy combat boot pressing down firmly on Richard's right hand, pinning it flat against the floor. "No, please! Please, God, no!" Richard shrieked, thrashing wildly. The tactical team closed in, 4 men stepping forward to pin his legs and shoulders to the floor. He was entirely immobilized. Kate turned her face away, looking out the shattered window into the darkness. She didn't want to watch, but she didn't ask her father to stop. In this world, blood demanded blood. Victor didn't use a weapon. He simply raised his other heavy boot, and with the detached precision of a man crushing a roach, he brought his heel down directly onto the back of Richard's pinned hand. The sound of multiple metacarpal bones snapping was a wet, heavy crunch that cut through the sound of the storm. Richard's scream was guttural, raw, and animalistic until his eyes rolled back in his head and he mercifully passed out, slumping lifelessly against the marble. The silence that followed was broken only by the steady drum of the rain. Alexander adjusted his cuffs, looking down at the unconscious man with mild disgust. "Clean it up," Alexander ordered, his voice echoing through the foyer. The tactical team immediately sprang into motion. They weren't just muscle, they were a highly organized extraction unit. 2 men jogged down the hallway toward Richard's study. Within seconds, Kate heard the sound of heavy axes smashing into the server racks that housed the mansion's internal security footage. Another man knelt beside Richard, quickly injecting a clear fluid into the unconscious man's neck. "What is that?" Kate asked, her voice raspy. It was the first time she had spoken directly to her father since his arrival. Alexander turned to her, his hard eyes softening infinitely. "A heavy sedative. He will wake up in 24 hours. By then, his world will be entirely gone, and we will be ghosts." He stepped closer, his large, calloused hands gently framing her face, taking care to avoid the brutal swelling on her cheek. "My beautiful girl. 10 years. I tore the earth apart looking for you. Why didn't you come to me? Did you think I would not protect you?" Kate looked into her father's eyes, seeing the ruthless monster the world feared and the desperate father who had mourned her. "I ran from the blood, Papa," she whispered. "I wanted a quiet life. I wanted normal." Alexander looked around the opulent, sprawling mansion, and then down at the broken man on the floor. "This is not normal, Kate. Men like him, they hide their monsters behind checkbooks and country clubs. At least in our family, we are honest about the wolves we are." He looked down at her swollen stomach, a deep, primal reverence flashing in his pale eyes. "You carry my grandchild." "Yes," Kate said, her hand resting protectively over her belly. "He threatened to take the baby, Papa. He was going to kill me and make it look like a complication and take my child. I couldn't run on my own. Not this time." "He will never look upon you or this child again," Alexander promised, his voice a vow of iron. "Victor." Victor approached, his hands wiped clean of the violence he had just inflicted. "The servers are slag, boss. The external security firm's remote backups have been wiped by the cyber team in the convoy. The gate logs are scrubbed. As far as the digital world is concerned, we were never here." "Good," Alexander said. He took off his custom-tailored overcoat and draped it over Kate's trembling shoulders. The wool was warm, smelling faintly of expensive Cuban cigars and old money. "Bring her a bag. Pack only what she needs. Nothing that ties her to this place." Victor nodded and moved swiftly up the grand staircase. Kate stood in the center of the ruined foyer, watching the meticulous destruction of her life. Men in black were wiping down door handles, collecting shell casings from the breached door, and ensuring no forensic footprint was left behind. It was a terrifyingly efficient machine. 10 minutes later, Victor returned with a single leather duffel bag. Inside were her essential documents, comfortable clothes, and the few pieces of jewelry that actually belonged to her before she met Richard. "It is time to go home, Kate," Alexander said, offering his arm. Kate looked at Richard one last time. He looked small, pathetic, and broken. He would wake up to a nightmare of his own making, stripped of his wealth, his reputation destroyed by the impending federal investigations, and his hand shattered. If he ever tried to speak of what happened tonight, if he ever muttered the name Volkov to the police, he knew exactly what would come for him in the dark. He was neutralized. She took her father's arm. They walked out through the gaping hole where the front door used to be, stepping out into the driving Connecticut storm. A massive, armored black Maybach had pulled up to the front steps, flanked by the Suburbans. Victor opened the rear door of the Maybach. The interior was a sanctuary of cream leather and warm, ambient lighting. Kate slid inside, sinking into the plush seat. Alexander slid in beside her, the heavy door thudding shut, instantly muting the howling wind and rain outside. As the convoy slowly rolled down the quarter-mile driveway, passing the still open iron gates, Kate didn't look back. The gilded cage was behind her. But as the adrenaline began to fade, a new, heavy realization settled into her bones. She had summoned a leviathan to crush a snake. The leviathan had answered, but now she was trapped in its jaws. The drive from Greenwich took over 2 hours. The convoy didn't head south toward the city. Instead, it snaked its way across the Tappan Zee Bridge and deep into the heavily wooded, ultra-exclusive enclaves of Alpine, New Jersey. The silence in the back of the Maybach was heavy. A private doctor, riding in the front passenger seat, had passed a medical kit back to Alexander. With surprising gentleness, the feared mob boss had cleaned the dried blood from Kate's chin and applied a cold compress to her bruised cheek. "The swelling will go down in a few days," Alexander murmured, watching the dark, tree-lined roads blur past the tinted, bulletproof windows. "The doctor will do a full ultrasound on the child as soon as we arrive. You will have the best obstetricians in the world flown in by morning." "Thank you, Papa," Kate said quietly, staring at her hands. "You are thinking about the future," Alexander observed, his sharp instincts reading her silence. "You are wondering if you have traded one prison for another." Kate looked up, meeting his pale blue eyes. "Have I?" Alexander sighed, a heavy, tired sound that momentarily aged him. "When you ran away, I was furious. Then I was heartbroken. Then I realized my failure. I built an empire of blood to protect my family, but the blood scared you away. I have spent 10 years restructuring, Kate. The street-level violence, the crude things you witnessed when you were a girl, that is largely in the past. We are a corporation now. A shadow corporation, yes, but we operate in boardrooms, not alleys." He reached out, placing his large hand over hers. "You are not a prisoner, Kate. You are a Volkov. But understand this, you can never go back to being a nobody. Richard Sterling proved that the world is full of predators who prey on the unprotected. Here, you are the apex." The Maybach slowed, turning off the main road onto a private, unmarked, mile-long driveway paved with pristine asphalt. They approached a massive set of solid steel gates, flanked by stone guardhouses. Men heavily armed with tactical rifles, wearing discreet earpieces, nodded as the convoy approached. The gates swung open silently. The Volkov compound was breathtaking. Set on a cliff overlooking the Hudson River, the estate was a sprawling, modern fortress of glass, steel, and dark stone. It was infinitely larger and more imposing than Richard's Connecticut mansion. This wasn't a home built by banking loans. It was a citadel built by supreme, untouchable power. The vehicles pulled into a massive subterranean garage, illuminated by harsh, bright LED lights. Dozens of luxury cars and armored SUVs were parked in perfect rows. Victor opened the door, and Kate stepped out into the dry, climate-controlled air. The exhaustion was finally catching up to her, her legs trembling slightly. "Take her to the East Wing," Alexander instructed the medical team. "Make sure she is comfortable. I will be up after I debrief with the financial team. I want Sterling's remaining assets liquidated and routed to our accounts in Zurich before sunrise." Kate was escorted up a private elevator that opened directly into a sprawling, penthouse-style suite. The walls were floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a panoramic view of the dark, churning river below. The bed was massive, the linen silk, and the security absolute. After the doctor examined her, confirming the baby's heart rate was strong and the stress hadn't triggered early labor, Kate was finally left alone. She walked into the lavish marble bathroom, looking at her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at her wasn't the terrified, subservient wife she had played for 3 years. The bruise on her face was a badge of survival. Richard had wanted a victim. He had wanted a vessel for his legacy. Kate placed her hands on the cold marble sink, leaning forward. The fear that had dictated her life for the past decade, fear of her father's world, fear of Richard's temper, began to evaporate, replaced by something entirely new. A cold, hard clarity. She had tried playing by the rules of the normal world, and it had nearly gotten her and her child killed. Her father was right. The world was full of predators. If she wanted to guarantee her child's absolute safety, she couldn't rely on hiding, and she couldn't rely solely on her aging father's protection. She had to become untouchable herself. She wasn't Kate Sterling anymore. She was Kate Volkoff, and she was heir to a shadow empire worth billions. An hour later, a soft knock echoed on the heavy bedroom door. Alexander stepped inside, looking drained but victorious. "Sterling is ruined," Alexander said softly, sitting on the edge of a velvet armchair near the window. "He is currently a pauper, bleeding on a marble floor. Are you at peace, Dorogaya?" Kate walked out of the bathroom. She had changed into a dark silk robe provided by the staff. She didn't look like a battered wife seeking comfort. She walked with a slow, deliberate grace, sitting opposite her father. "I am at peace with his fate," Kate said, her voice steady and devoid of its usual tremor. Alexander studied her, a flicker of surprise crossing his hardened features. "You look different." "I am different, Papa," she replied, resting her hands on her stomach. "You said you spent the last 10 years restructuring the family into a corporation." "I have," Alexander nodded cautiously. "And who runs the legitimate fronts? The shell companies? The international shipping logistics? I have a board of advisors, men I trust. Victor handles security, Thomas handles the banking, Silas manages the ports." Kate held his gaze. "I spent 3 years listening to a billionaire real estate developer dissect corporate takeovers, tax loopholes, and municipal zoning corruption. I know how the legitimate world washes its hands, Papa. I know how men like Richard hide their sins in plain sight." Alexander leaned forward, a dangerous, thrilling spark igniting in his pale eyes. "What are you saying, Kate?" "I am saying that I am not going to hide in this tower and be a pampered princess while you fight the wars outside," Kate stated, her voice hardening into steel. "I have a child coming, a Volkoff heir. I want full access to the family's financial portfolios. I want to know where every dollar comes from and where it goes. I want an office next to yours, Papa." Alexander stared at her for a long, heavy moment. The silence stretched, fraught with the shifting dynamics of power. For the first time in his life, the ruthless head of the Volkoff syndicate looked utterly, entirely proud. A slow, terrifying smile spread across Alexander's face. "The lamb," he whispered, has finally grown teeth. "The lamb is dead," Kate said coldly. "Show me the books, Papa. It's time I learned the family business." 3 years later. The crisp autumn wind whipped across the tarmac of Teterboro Airport, carrying the distinct scent of jet fuel and turning leaves. A sleek, customized Gulfstream G650 stood ready, its engines whining a low, eager hum. At the base of the stairs stood a small phalanx of men in tailored suits, not the tactical black of the past, but the quiet, expensive armor of modern security. Among them, immovable as ever, stood Victor, his eyes scanning the perimeter with practiced paranoia. A black Maybach glided to a stop near the plane. The rear door opened, and Kate Volkoff stepped out. She was no longer the frightened, battered woman who had fled Connecticut in the dead of night. At 32, she was a terrifyingly composed force of nature. She wore a pristine, white-tailored coat over a charcoal silk blouse, her dark hair swept back into a sharp, uncompromising chignon. The only trace of the violence from 3 years ago was a faint, silvery crescent scar resting high on her right cheekbone, a deliberate choice to forgo cosmetic surgery. It was her reminder, her armor. Holding her hand was a vibrant, dark-haired 2-year-old boy named Leo. He wore a miniature cashmere sweater and looked at the private jet with wide, curious eyes. "Mama, fly?" Leo asked, tugging on her hand. Kate smiled, a genuine soft expression reserved entirely for him. "Yes, Mishka, we fly. We are going to see grandfather in Geneva." Victor stepped forward, dipping his head in a respectful nod. "The cabin is prepared, Kate. The financial reports from the Rotterdam port expansion are on your desk." "Thank you, Victor," she said smoothly, her voice carrying the quiet, absolute authority that had once belonged solely to her father. In the 3 years since she had returned to the fold, Kate hadn't just learned the family business, she had revolutionized it. Alexander had kept his promise, pulling back from the brutal, street-level enforcement that had defined his youth, focusing entirely on the legitimate corporate fronts. Kate had taken those fronts and weaponized them. She had weaponized the very systems Richard Sterling had taught her to revere. Using the vast, untraceable wealth of the Volkoff syndicate, Kate had established a sprawling web of venture capital firms and private equity groups. She didn't buy politicians with briefcases of cash. She bought their re-election campaigns through impenetrable super PACs. She didn't break legs to secure shipping lanes. She engineered aggressive corporate takeovers of rival logistics companies, drowning them in litigation and predatory pricing until they folded. She was the CEO of a shadow empire, operating in the sunlit world of high finance, a wolf wearing the skin of a corporate titan. And the world had no idea the blood that ran through her veins. "There is one final matter before we depart, Kate," Victor rumbled quietly, falling into step beside her as they approached the jet's stairs. He handed her a slim, encrypted tablet. Kate took it, her eyes skimming the text. It was a brief intelligence report, accompanied by a recent photograph. The photograph showed a man in his mid-40s, looking 30 years older. He was gaunt, his once sharp features hollowed out by stress, alcohol, and the relentless, crushing weight of utter ruin. He wore a cheap, ill-fitting suit, standing outside a dingy strip mall in upstate New York. His right hand was encased in a permanent, clumsy brace. The bones had healed poorly, leaving him with a crippling lack of dexterity. It was Richard Sterling. He was denied parole on the final federal fraud charges, Victor stated flatly, but his lawyers managed to plead down the embezzlement. He was released yesterday. He has no assets, no contacts. The local crews in Albany have been instructed to ensure he finds no employment above minimum wage. Kate stared at the photograph. She felt a flicker of memory. The heavy thud of his footsteps, the sting of his palm, the suffocating terror of the gilded cage. But the memory felt distant, like an old movie she had watched a long time ago. There was no fear left, only cold, clinical satisfaction. The night Alexander Volkov had shattered Richard's hand, he had shattered the man's reality. The following morning, Richard had woken up in a silent, empty mansion, his hand screaming in agony. When he finally managed to call the police, he sounded like a raving lunatic. He claimed a Russian hit squad had blown off his door and erased his fortune. But when the police arrived, they found no evidence of a breach. The heavy oak doors had been meticulously replaced by a local contractor hired anonymously overnight. The server racks were pristine, containing loops of boring, uneventful security footage. The blood was gone. Kate was gone. And when Richard tried to access his offshore accounts to hire a defense team for the sudden avalanche of SEC and FBI investigations that hit him that same day, he found nothing but zeros. He was a madman screaming about ghosts while the federal government systematically dismantled his life for the very real financial crimes he had committed for a decade. He went from a billionaire titan to a convicted felon, living in a 6x8 cell in less than a year. "Does he know we are watching?" Kate asked, her voice devoid of emotion. "No," Victor replied. "He is entirely broken, a ghost haunting his own life." Kate nodded slowly. She tapped the screen, deleting the file. "Leave him be. Let him live his small, pathetic life, looking over his shoulder every time the wind blows. It's a worse punishment than anything we could do to him now." She handed the tablet back to Victor and scooped Leo into her arms. The toddler giggled, burying his face in her neck. "Let's go, Mama," Leo mumbled. "We are going, my love," Kate said, turning toward the stairs. She ascended into the luxurious cabin of the Gulf Stream, the heavy door ceiling shut behind her, locking out the noise of the tarmac. The engines roared to life, a powerful testament to the untouchable world she now commanded. As the jet taxied down the runway and lifted smoothly into the autumn sky, Kate Volkov looked out the window at the receding earth below. She had run from monsters her whole life, only to discover the most potent defense was to become the architect of their cages. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was reigning. And God help the man who ever tried to put a hand on her or her son again. The story of Kate Volkov is a chilling reminder that the quietest individuals often harbor the most profound complexities. It strips away the facade of high society glamour to expose the primal, unforgiving machinery that operates beneath the surface of the world's elite. Richard Sterling's fatal arrogance blinded him to a fundamental truth. Power is not merely accumulated in bank accounts. It is inherited in blood and forged in trauma. He mistook submission for weakness, inadvertently awakening a sleeping giant that systematically dismantled his existence. Kate's evolution from a fleeing victim to the calculated, ruthless heir of a syndicate empire illustrates the terrifying lengths one will go to ensure survival. In the end, the gilded cage was replaced not by freedom, but by an iron throne, proving that sometimes escaping a monster simply requires becoming a more formidable one.